Hi everyone, welcome back to video number 2 in a 3-part series on fishing map terms that you need to know. Now in last video we talked about the basic terms that anglers need to know before you get to the lake. We talked about how to understand contour lines, we talked about humps, we talked about flats, we talked about channel swings, we talked about points, and we really broke down the basic fishing terms that anglers need to know when you go out fishing. Now in this video we're going to expand on some of those concepts. We're going to go into more intermediate terms and really dive into more pattern-based terms that anglers need to know when you're talking about fishing. And what really spurred this video on for me was a couple years ago I was fishing Lake Guntersville with my buddy Shay Baker, and I was talking with these guys about fishing and I thought I had a good grasp on what they were talking about, but they started using some terminology that I didn't understand. Coming up here from the Midwest, we don't have some of the same concepts and discussions that those guys do that are very, very advanced fishermen. So in this video, we're going to break down those intermediate terms that you need to know as a fisherman that will help you understand what you're looking at a lake map to have more success. So if you guys enjoy this style of video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and share this video out to someone that you might think would enjoy or needs to understand some of these intermediate fishing terms. But without further ado, let's dive into the video.
So in today's video, we're going to focus on a little bit more advanced topics, advanced terms, and these are really going to kind of build on those other concepts that we talked about in the last video, which were points, humps, creeks, cuts, flats, or creeks, cuts, canals, arms, flats, and then channels and channel swings. And today, we're really going to start to build on some of those topics by talking about some next level things that will help you understand and identify these contours or these areas on your lake maps. Now, what we're looking at right now is Guntersville Lake, and Guntersville Lake obviously is one of the most popular fishing destinations in the country, but it's a great lake to look at, and this is where I started to get really excited about talking about fishing terms with you guys, was because this is where my eyes really got opened to understanding different terms that guys might talk about that we up here in the Midwest may not discuss, or as we're getting into fishing, are terms that you have to kind of know. I went down there to fish a rattle trap tournament with my buddy Shay Baker, and the way that these guys talk about fishing, the terms that they use, were so over my head that I didn't even understand some of the things that they were talking about. So let's take a look at Guntersville. Let's dive into some of these intermediate terms, and I'll show you what they look like on the map. Now, the first one that we're going to talk about are bluffs. Now, when you start to talk about bluffs, we're talking typically about channel swing bluffs. So where that channel swing pushes up against a bank, and then the bank drops off immediately into deep water. So there's not like a slope to the bank. There's not like a little area of shallow water. It's like that channel swing pushes up against the lake's bank, and it creates a vertical up and down drop off into deep water. So if we take a look here on Guntersville, it's a little bit harder than some of those other maps that I showed you, but you have your main channel, which is right here illustrated with some of these blue lines, and then it pushes right up against this bank right here, and it even says Street Bluff, but it pushes right up against this bank, and as you guys can tell, those contour lines very, very close together. It falls off into really, really deep water, 40 plus foot of water right off of the bank. Now, a lot of times when you start to talk about bluffs, the best spots to look for fish on bluffs is the start and the end of that bluff where those contour lines start to spread out again. But fish can use bluffs, and the reason they like to use bluffs is because you have a lot of current that flows on the end of that channel swing, and then it will position bait there, and those fish can feed really easily and move up and down very quickly. So be in 2 foot of water up right underneath the surface on that bluff, or be in 40 foot of water depending on how deep or how quickly the conditions change. So you have that channel swing where it pushes up against the bank. You have this little section of shallow water here where that bluff starts, and then it drops off into deep water. You know, this area where it gets a little bit more gapped out might be a good spot to hold some fish. And then it starts to spread out here as it leads back up into this creek. Might be a good area to hold some fish. And then it restarts again and goes down to where that channel starts to turn back towards the other bank. So that's an example of a bluff. Another example would be right here where that channel swing is again. Pushes right up against the bank there. And then it leads up into whatever this creek or area of the lake is, Goat Island. Really popular area in Guntersville. So that is what a bluff is, where that contour or where that channel pushes up against a bank and falls off immediately into really deep water. Now, talking about something a little bit different, instead of bluffs, we're going to talk about sloping banks, and I'm going to actually move to a different lake to talk about sloping banks. We'll come back to Gunnersville. But those 45-degree banks, those banks that a lot of guys talk about when they're fishing in the spring and the pre-spawn, talking about pre-spawners, those transition banks, those 45-degree banks, those areas where it's a little bit more sloping into the water, and a lot of that is formed when the lake goes up and down, and you have these areas that are kind of more sloping into the body of water. So if we go back to Dale Hollow, you obviously have bluffs as well, which can be seen right here. That channel swing pushes up against this bank. But then you also have these 45 or sloping banks. You have these banks where those contour lines start to spread out a little bit, very evenly spread out towards deeper water. And the fish will get on these as they come up to spawn or pre-spawn on areas. Then you can actually pattern this around the lake, and this is what a lot of guys will target when they talk about transition banks. They'll go down the lake, they'll be looking for these areas where maybe it goes from one rock to a different type of rock, and then that transitions into deeper water. This is typically what they're looking for, those 45-degree style banks. Alex really loves this style of fishing. This is like those crankbait banks where you're able to take that crankbait, throw it into 2 foot of water, and then bring it down that 45-degree ledge and catch fish. So another example of that, if we just kind of follow this channel swing, here's a good example of it, right? Big long point coming out, and then up into this creek, you have these slow tapering banks, and you can get up here shallow, throw that crankbait into the dirt, and bring it out into 20 plus foot of water. Another good example, as we push back into this creek, you have these sloping banks right here. So it's direct opposite of a bluff where it falls off immediately into deep water. 45-degree bank is more tapering, gives those fish an opportunity to push up and kind of move up a little bit more slowly, and can be a great area for them to spawn or get up as they get ready for pre-spawn. Now let's start to talk about bays. We've talked about cuts and creek arms, which are really, really long, narrow sections of the lake coming off of your main body of water. But to me, a bay is like these really short arms that come off of either the creek or the main lake. So to me, a bay would be something like this little nodule here coming off of the main lake, or a bay could be something like in this big creek, Sulphur Creek, this little area here where it pushes off of the main creek itself. But it's not a big long arm. It's not a big long protrusion. Like, to me, this is a creek. It flows back, way back off of the bank. Then you have these little bays back in the bank. Or back in the creek. To me, it's important to know the difference, because when someone says they're fishing up in a creek, they're probably talking about these areas where it goes way back off of the main lake. But if they're saying they're fishing a bay off of the main river or off of a creek, they're fishing these little changes right here. So to me, it's kind of a minor difference, but it could be the difference between you really having a good day and maybe not catching them. So if we go back to Gunnersville, we'll take another look at that. Gunnersville has the same thing. You have Spring Creek, which is one of the most popular creeks on Gunnersville, and then you have these little bays coming off of it. So you have Spring Creek, then you have this little bay right here. You have, where's another example? This little bay right here. You have these little bays coming off of creeks, or you can kind of do it all around the lake. To me, it's just important to know the difference between creeks and bays, because when people start to talk about it, in my opinion, there is a difference, and it could be the difference between really having a great day or having kind of just a decent day on a body of water. Because if someone says, hey, I'm catching them, I'm going up in these little bays, these fish are starting to spawn up in there, it's really important to know, okay, am I looking for a big creek that these fish are in? Are they on bays off the main lake? Are they on bays back up in a creek? To me, there's differences in that, so it's just a small change that would be really important to know whether or not, or what kind of bays guys are talking about. Now we're going to talk about breaks and ledges. And Guntersville's obviously known as a ledge fishery. You have these great stories of guys catching them on ledges in Guntersville or in Kentucky Lake or in Chickamauga. But to me, a ledge is like this area. You have your main river channel, and then you have it come up into shallower water. Okay, so the ledge is this break right here, this drop off right here. It doesn't have to be off of the main river channel, though. It could be a ledge off of like a creek bed. So you have Browns Creek right here. And you could have this ledge right here off of this little creek where it just drops off. Or if you're talking about up here in Michigan, to me, a ledge could be something like where the lake drops off into deep water. Now, we're back up here in Hubbard Lake. We talk about it more like a drop off, but where that lake goes from shallower water and falls off into deeper water zones. Now, there's going to be sweet spots along the ledge. Typically, you look for a ledge, you look for where those points come off the ledge, or where you have a flat spot adjacent to a ledge. But when people talk about ledges, they're talking about that drop off into deeper water. And that could also be related to shallower water zones, right? You could talk about shallow water ledges. So take, for example, St. Clair. And St. Clair doesn't have really major contour changes, but what they do have are micro drop-offs. So you're talking, 6 to 8 foot of water. They're on that ledge from 6 to 8. So in the springtime, a lot of guys will say, okay, yeah, we're catching them, in 6 to 9, or we're catching them in 4 to 6, or we're catching them in 9 to 12. Well, that's important on a place like St. Clair because you have these really small drop-offs that make a huge, huge difference. So if we go here just south of Gawker Point, you have like a 4 to 6 foot ledge, you have a 6 to 8 foot ledge, and you have a 8 to 10 or 8 to 12 foot ledge. You have these little ledges where these contour lines will fall off into the next depth. So like 5 to 7 foot ledge, a 6 to 9 foot ledge, a 10 to 12 foot ledge. It can be really small contour changes as well. It doesn't have to be these major drop-offs to constitute a drop-off, a ledge, or a break. For smallmouth as well, the rule of thumb is still the same as if you were ledge fishing. You're going to target the changes in the ledge, the area where those contour lines maybe start to spread out a little bit, or you're targeting the flatter areas, or you're targeting the steeper breaks. So let's take for example this drop off here on Charlottesville Lake, right? You have this drop off here where it's pretty much a bluff. It drops off from 3 to 28 foot of water, and it all looks the same, right? Well, you might get this section of the ledge here where it starts to taper out a little bit, where these fish want to hang out. They may hang out on that little area where it's a little bit flatter, or they may hang out on this really steep area. Like, looking for those changes in the drop-off or the ledge can be the difference between catching them and not catching them. So a lot of times when you're looking at ledges, or you're looking at breaks, or you're looking at drop-offs, you're looking for those changes in the ledge to help position fish. And then finally, let's talk about something called saddles. In saddles, you'll hear people talk about in deep water. You'll also hear people talk about saddles in shallower water to help them locate fish. And essentially what a saddle is a blow-through area. It's an area where you have 2 spots of higher elevation, and then it drops off into a section of a little bit lower elevation, and it gives those fish somewhere to set up on. So just coming back up in this creek, this to me would be a saddle. You have shallower water, and then you have this saddle right here where that cursor is that fish can set up on and blow through. A lot of times this is a great wintering spot to target fish, or during the pre-spawn, and there's saddles all over. Here's another saddle. You can tell because you have deep water, and then you have a little, I guess it's even a high spot surrounded by deep water, but then you have these 2 high spots here. That's really the characteristic of what I would consider a saddle. Tons of humps. A lot of times it's in between 2 humps. Here's a really shallow saddle. You have an island, and then you have just a little saddle in between these areas. A saddle to me is a great area to look for fish, especially during the winter time or the summertime when those fish get off of that shallower water location or off of those shallow spots. And it can be a great spot when they are kind of off of the feed. Like, a lot of times fish will push up into the shallow area to feed, but then they'll kind of slide back out to the deeper water into that saddle when they're done feeding. And especially with forward-facing sonar, it's a great area to kind of back off and start to scan with your forward facing to locate these fish. Here's a good example of a saddle on a northern Michigan lake. You have a high spot, and then you have this little blow through area where fish can set up, and it's surrounded by deep water on both sides. So when those fish get off of these high spots, they can push off onto the saddle and either just rest or feed. And typically those fish are suspended on these saddles. But this is just a good example on a northern Michigan body of water. So those are my examples of more intermediate terms that build off of some of the basics. But you had a bluff and sloping banks. You had bays, breaks, ledges, or drop-offs, depending on where you live and what you're fishing. And then the saddles. So hopefully this gives you guys a little bit more detail on what these guys are talking about when they start to discuss some of these contours and why they're talking about them. But really, these are things that you have to apply when you're out fishing to help you maybe have the conversations or identify these areas when you're having conversations about what you're doing to catch fish. So when you're catching fish, up in a bay, or you're catching fish off of a ledge, you know what you're talking about when you go back to tell your buddy, hey, I located these fish on the drop, and there was a little point that came out where those contour lines got tighter. That's where those fish were located. So it just helps you have a little bit more in-depth conversation with your buddies when you start to break down areas, and when people tell you kind of what the bite is, how to look for those areas on your body of water.
So if you guys enjoyed that video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below if you're not already, and share this video with someone that might need to know some of these intermediate terms. We really kind of broke down some more advanced concepts in this video that built off the beginner terms that we talked about in video number 1. But if you haven't already watched that one, go over, check it out. It's going to be linked right here for you guys. Or if you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button right here, because it will let you know when I post more videos just like this one. Now, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.